One Piece chapter 1125 is here, and it was an extraordinary chapter. First of all, last week or this week, we got the episode of the anime where we actually heard Imu's voice, which sounded very distorted and otherworldly, non-human. And that could be just a stalling method before we reveal who Imu truly is, or it could have been done under advisement of Oda, noting that Imu is not actually human, or maybe noting that Imu is so ancient that the humanity of Imu has been distorted. How did you interpret the voice if you did watch that episode? The chapter 2, we got to see a lot of, we saw a little bit of Imu, but we saw a lot of what Imu's power really can do. First of all, when CP0 returns back to report on removing themselves from Egghead Island and reporting on what happened, Lucci says that he killed Stussy. So I don't know. I'm gonna shout out my patrons because we talked through what all this means. I think my initial theory was that he was covering for Kaku because he cares about Kaku so much, and Kaku was like, no, I'm not gonna tell you what happened to Stussy. And so Lucci's like, okay, fine, I'll cover for you. I'll make sure that you're good, and I'll just take the heat. But then one of my patrons mentioned that it's also possible that Kaku lied to Lucci and said, yeah, when you stabbed her and she went down, she died. So either Lucci is covering for Stussy, covering for Kaku, or has been lied to. Either way, the story right now that's being told is that Stussy is dead, even though we know that she continues to live on, which fits in line with a whole bunch of other people in this chapter that are believed to be dead, and yet they continue on. Easily for me, the best elements of this chapter are all surrounding Saturn. First of all, the Saturn saying, no, I don't care about you following the Straw Hats into Elbaf. That's not my priority right now. And the fixation is on the Iron Giant. And the fixation is there because he's personally responsible for the Iron Giant. A twist I never would have expected, because Saturn was he just seemed so loyal to the idea of Imu is the one we follow. We don't disobey Imu. You know, coming in to Egghead Island saying you have disobeyed the world government, you've disobeyed our orders to not research the Void Century. I don't care what your interest is. You have to die for this. And then what happens? It turns out that 200 years ago, Saturn was the one that ordered the scientists to disobey direct orders, to dismantle the Iron Giant for the sake of knowledge. That parallel between Saturn and Vegapunk, that Vegapunk's undoing, the thing that caused his ultimate demise, was his greed and his desire to just keep learning and keep knowing more and keep pursuing, split himself even for the sake of being able to invent more and learn more. And then that led him to research into the Void Century, and that was what got the government on his back. So greed was his undoing, and I would argue a lack of wisdom as well. Check out my Vegapunk analysis video if you're interested. But that greed was his ultimate undoing on the island, in his relationships, and ultimately with the world government. And Saturn was the one to spearhead his destruction because of that greed for further information, and the fact that Saturn himself was subject to that too. That Saturn, even the one who's meant to enforce absolute obedience to the world government, too cannot resist the draw of knowledge, of greater understanding, to the point that he is one of the chosen servants of the one who sits on the empty throne, and he still chose understanding and knowledge over that obedience. Like, that was a twist that I never saw coming. Shucks for him that he thought that it would prove to be useful for the government one day, and in fact it was what hid the transmission that was the undoing of the world government's secrets and lies. Oh, the irony. That's beautiful. We had a Marine who asked questions. Okay, so if you consider that a failure, then that would mean that Vegapunk's message, he wasn't lying, he was telling the truth? He got dead for that. Or badly injured, more than likely, since they wanted the medical team, but that wasn't the question to ask in that moment. Okay, so then we have the stuff that happened with the Cloud punk records with Edison. So I had hoped and believed that Edison could still be alive because we didn't get any sort of finality with him. I thought that he was still physically with us, and I was so pleased to see him again. I love this panel of him in the darkness, and he says, "Oops, busted." Oh my goodness, what a sweetheart. I love that scene. But he starts creating more Skypea clouds to lift up punk records, to make it float away. So even though the government ultimately won this battle, you know, like they came out on top. The Straw Hats had to flee. They got everything that they went to get. They got York. They killed Vegapunk. They got punk records. They got the Mother Flame. Like, it was a failure from the perspective of Emu because, you know, the message got out. So that was a victory for Vegapunk, but there was also a lot of victory for the Gorosei as well. But the fact that they had that one little thing to reassure themselves, like, yes, ultimately the worst thing possible happened, but at least we got what we came here for. And then one of them just floats away. Oh, it's beautiful. I love it. I also really loved this page that showed the Celestial Dragons mourning that they have food shortage, because it really just shows how isolated they are and how little understanding they have of the way the world works. That they're just like, all I know is that I deserve to have beef when I want beef. So what's the problem here? We should probably execute the guy that's in charge of food. Everybody's being lazy. Let's just, like, their idea of we're above ground so we don't have to worry about the world dying. Wait a second, why is our food not being supplied by the people who are servitude to us, that we don't care if they're dying? This isn't adding up to me. I don't understand. It really just shows how short-sighted they are, that they don't comprehend that the people that they expect to serve them, to work for them, to provide everything that they could possibly want, would need to stay alive in order for that system to continue to function. They just... Oda makes them very easily hateable. So then, Garling waltzes into the Chamber of Power, just starts chatting with them so casually, and the elders are like, show some respect. What are you doing? Who do you think you are? And he sits down, and he's like, I think I'm the godhead of science and defense. Oh, what a great scene. One of my patrons pointed out how funny it is that that Marcus is probably irritated because Garling's first day on the job, he gets to sit and Marcus still stands. But Garling just walks in and informs all of us, I'm the new godhead of science and defense. Here I am. Which leaves me, the reader, going, what do you mean? So you're telling me that Saturn is no longer that? How? What's gonna happen to Saturn? Well, let me turn the page and see that Emu has sucked the power directly out of him, the essence of him, so whatever it is. So a lot of things here. So Garling being promoted from Celestial Dragon, from the Knights, being promoted into Celestial Dragon. All of the elders likely were Celestial Dragons that were promoted to the position of my personal yokai. So, and then that power, the yokai abilities, were inserted into the elders. So that's interesting to me because I've been saying that I don't think that they have devil fruits, that I think that they are yokai themselves. So they're clearly not. They clearly are humans that have been turned into yokai users or yokai people. It still clearly seems to me like they do not have devil fruits, that this is an ability given to them by Emu and that can be taken away by Emu as well if they fail him. And the removal of this power looks agonizing. It looks completely like this was tangled into the core of who they were, and removing it disintegrates them. Removing it removes their very selves, which does certainly make sense because this chapter was confirmed that Saturn was alive 200 years ago. So if his, whatever it is that Emu has put inside of him is now being removed from him, then yeah, he's going to turn to bones and dust because he shouldn't be alive 200 years later. So he's now been reduced back to, I suppose, his human form, which is going to be bones and dust this long after he should have naturally died. This scene, though, this entire section of Garling walking into the Chamber of Power, sitting down and declaring his new position, and then we cut to the person of the old position and we see what happens when someone disobeys. We see what happens when someone fails Emu and when someone fails to follow Emu's orders, when someone is deemed unworthy. This is what they get. This horrifying scene is what they get. Also, pointed out to me is that because Saturn wanted to maintain the Iron Giant because for research, where is that panel? Here it is. The giant represents the future. It will prove very useful to the military one day. So because Saturn wants to research the Iron Giant and believes that it represents the future, this also means that Saturn is not as old as the Void Century, is not as old as Emu. So potentially we've cycled through other yokai before this. Or, I mean, the yokai system could have been established long after Emu took over the empty throne, but it's also possible that this isn't the first time Emu has removed his power from someone, though it does seem that as long as you'll serve Emu unquestioningly, unflinchingly, loyally, then you will maintain your position as not this thing that's being disintegrated and tortured in front of us until it's nothing but bones. Oh my goodness, these panels were so good. And wonderfully, this is what T-Scene depicted this week. Saturn being ultimately destroyed by having his powers lifted. How agonizing that was for him, really fixating on the eyes and him reaching up seemingly for help. The powers circling behind him. There's even a face in the swirling patterns, which I didn't even notice when I first read the chapter, that the ink or whatever that was swirling out of him actually looked like that. But it looks incredible, and I'm so glad that T-Scene focused on this scene for her artwork this week. I also just really love that this chapter showed that a scientist, that Saturn was sent to kill a scientist for disobeying, and what we got was that Saturn, the scientist, was killed for his disobedience. And in that very same chapter, we see how Vegapunk's satellites live on and how they're going to move forward. Okay, so all of the Vegapunks that are not the Stella, all of the satellites are currently still conscious. Their consciousness are still uploaded to the cloud. They still exist in their personalities, in their minds, even though they don't have a physical form anymore. So, well, everybody but Edison and York and Lilith. All the ones that died are still alive. They just don't have a body anymore, which is narratively consistent for how they were created and for the fact that Atlas was able to just be repaired after she was essentially killed by Lucci when Lucci first entered Egghead. So all of that is narratively consistent. But my one complaint for this chapter is just, I think I just don't fully understand, and maybe you can explain it to me, maybe you get it. I don't fully understand what Oda's goal here was for putting them all in one body, because we have all of their consciousness that are still alive, they just don't have bodies. And then we have a room full of their bodies. Just like a whole room full of rows and rows and rows of spare parts that Edison can put together and then upload their consciousness to. But instead, Edison grabs a singular piece of each of them and creates a Frankenstein of all of them, and then they all share that one body. Now, I think that this would work really well if there was a discussion on page of them saying, this was ultimately a mistake for Vegapunk to isolate a piece of himself and give it its own personality, its own consciousness to live and evolve and grow and run itself. And so now we need to move forward, trying to work together as one, because that's that's the way it was meant to be. Now, Vegapunk does express regret when he realizes that York betrayed them all, and he says, "Oh, this is what I get for isolating Greed." But there was no discussion among the satellites saying we need to work together as one, as humanity is meant to be, as a person is meant to be. It's just like this odd sort of, we're all here, let's go on a holiday. No, we can't do that, we don't have funding. Okay, grab spare, and then Edison grabs spare pieces, and then they all get together and they're like, ha, this is hilarious. I think we can infer that that's the intention behind this. I think that we can kind of read between the lines and assume, okay, this must be happening. But I think in order for it to have the impact that is, like, because this would be a big thematic choice for the conclusion of the arc, or for the, post-arc discussion of regret of this greed that caused Vegapunk to split himself, and how that didn't work. And so now they try to find a way to merge back together, minus evil and greed, which also would need a little bit of a discussion of how does that work. I don't know if I'm articulating myself well. I guess my point is just that this scene didn't really work for me, because it seems odd not to just build out each of their bodies again, unless there was a point to be made about them all coming together. And if so, at least personally, I would want the point to be highlighted a little bit more, so that it could feel like it's, that's that full circle sort of moment. Ultimately, it is a little thing in an otherwise extraordinary chapter, though. And then the chapter ends on Dragon saying, "The problem, Vegapunk, is that not everyone who believes your warning is going to prepare for this looming disaster peacefully. This demands a swift resolution, because it won't be long before the people of the world begin to fight over safe ground." Which is so true, and such an excellent launching point for what is going to be the final war, for what is going to be the world thrown into chaos. Understandably so. It was such a great, chaos is coming kind of introduction. Anyway, excellent chapter, amazing chapter. I feel like we got a lot of clarity on the system of the Gorosei, and on how devastating Emu's powers are once removed from one of his servants, and how authoritarian he really is, which isn't a surprise. But if the fact that an elder can disobey, and what happens when that comes, was so well done. Do let me know what you thought about the chapter. I would love to hear what you thought about all these reveals, about the Emu voice in the anime, and the Garling stepping up into a new position while Saturn is utterly destroyed from his. Please do chat with me more in the comments. I'll see you again soon. Bye.